Hello and welcome to the fourth video in this BiteSize Pandas series. In this video we're going to take our first look at columns and things you can do with columns. This will be a two-part because the second part's a little bit more complicated. I'm starting from where I'll probably start most of the videos in this series, so importing pandas as PD, setting the max rows, max columns option, and just reading in the animals.csv file, which is in the same folder as I'm running this notebook. So just as a quick recap, that should be fairly obvious by now. I'll just do a quick head on this data frame that's loaded from the CSV. And I have here the three columns that we're now probably familiar with, the weight, animal and age, as well as the indexes. And I wanted, after we've done some selecting of data, I wanted to show you how we can actually do some other common operations. And one of the most common operations people want to do is they want to rename a column. And we can do this by using some functionality that's already inside the Pandas library. I'm just going to do head 2 for space reasons here and scroll down a tiny bit because I'm conscious in the last video of trying to keep everything zoomed in nicely but also be able to see everything on the screen. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename the weight column to something different to show you how to do that. Now, this is one of the operations that, well, first of all, I'll show you doing it this way. So I'm going to call rename and then have an argument. By the way, if you open a function and do shift and tab, then you get a list of all the arguments that you can have are available for a function. In this case, we've got index and columns. So here what I want to do is I want to use the columns, and here I can submit basically an object and describe which columns I want renaming, and it's done just on a column and new name basis. So here I want to say I'm going to rename the weight column, and I'll rename this to WGHT. That also has to be in speech marks as well, otherwise we'll get an error. And I'll do the H one as well, why not? Also, just so that we've got more than one in there for completion of example. So there's a comma there, then age, and then I'll call this one WIRS for years, like so. And this will now rename the columns in the data frame, but it actually won't. What it's done is it's printed me the result of renaming these columns. I've now got WGHT, animal and years. If I go back here and run the head operation, I've still got the original column names here. And that's because I'm literally doing a statement that's analog to, say, doing something like this, declaring num is equal to 3, and then just typing num. That for me then prints to the output 3. I'm doing exactly the same equivalent of just typing num alone here, except here I'm saying please print to me, to the output, the result of renaming these columns on this data frame. I'm not actually modifying this data frame. To do this modification, I'm actually going to say that the data frame is going to be equal to the data frame with the renaming. And now when I do that, if I go back up here and just call this head again, you remember that we have to be in the order of execution, not the order we're coding on the web page. You'll see that the two columns have been renamed. So that's renaming columns. The other thing that people often want to do is add a column onto the data frame. So if I just delete this from here and take my animals, and adding a new column is very, very easy. I just make some parentheses, and now I'll just put a new column, and I can already set the value of what I want that new column to be. And in this case, I will now have in the data frame, if I just call head as usual for the first 5 rows, I now have a new column with 0, the value 0 there. I could just put strings or anything I wanted as long as it's valid inside there, and I have a new column. Very nice. I can also make the new column equivalent to something that's actually calculated. So for instance, I could say that the new column should actually be equal to, and here I'm just going to overwrite the existing new col. So let's just go back here actually. Get our data frame again, rename our columns. If I do a head, we haven't got our new column here. So now I'm going to say new column should be equal to, let's say, the weight. And I'll do the weight multiplied by, let's do 100, like this. And now we've got a new column with the weight here multiplied by 100. So very nice. We can also do something like, if I just restart again the data frame, and rename the columns so we're back to where we were, I could do something like actually make it the multiple of values of 2 columns. So I could do not times 100 but times YRS for years this time, and that will now give us our new column where the weight has been multiplied by the year. So again, very, very convenient and very, very nice and simple. Now, if you want to do more complicated things, like say we want to make a column with just the first 2 letters of each entry in a certain series or something, or we want to do something more complicated calculation, we have to use something called list comprehension, or we have to apply a function to a series, and we'll look at that in the next video because I want this a bit more complicated and I want to separate these 2 out. But for now, that's the basics of adding a column on. The last thing I want to look at though is how we actually delete a column. This column is fairly useless, new col, and I'd like to get rid of this column, so I'm just going to reduce the amount of data that comes out there. And now what I want to do is have a look at actually how we do this, and we do this using something called drop. So again, I'll take my data frame, and here I've got .drop, which is a function, and here I can look at the arguments that go in here, and there's going to be something else interesting with this in place argument in here. So the first thing we want to do when we do drop is we actually want to say what we want to drop. And the important thing here is this axis. If an axis is 0, it means that we're dropping on a row by row basis. If the axis is 1, we're dropping on a column or series basis. So for example, if I just go back actually and do the first 4 entries of my data frame, in this data frame here, I'm actually going to drop, and we give this as a list. I'm going to drop indexes, the entries at indexes 0 and 2. The axis was already defaulted to 0, but we'll type it for completeness, the axis 0 like so. And now what I'll get in my data frame is I won't have the axis 0 or 2. I've got the rows 0 with index 0 or 2, because on the axis 0, which is row by row, I've dropped or deleted those entries. But I haven't. If I do the head again on animals, I've still got them there. And why is this? Well, if you remember, that's because we're just printing the result of this operation. And you remember that above here, when we did the column renaming, we did df animals is equal to this. And then we got the result working as expected here. If I run this head again, you'll now see that the 0 and 2 have disappeared. However, if I go back and recreate my data frame, so I've got the 0, 1 and 2, you'll notice that when we looked at the drop, there's an argument called inPlace, and it's set equal to false. With the drop, and in fact with many functions, I don't actually need to use the DataFrame animals equal to DataFrame animals. What I can do is just use the inPlace argument and set this to true, and this will then modify inPlace this data frame. And now if I send the head, then you'll see, or execute the head, then you'll see that I have indeed dropped those 2 rows. So if I want to drop some columns then it should be pretty obvious what we need to do. I'm just going to put 1. Here we need a list, but this time we need the names of the series. So in this case, I'm going to say I want to drop a new col in this way. And now if I execute this, again it's in place, and I rerun head, then we'll see that new col has disappeared. And that really covers it for this video. That's how you add a column onto a data frame. Very simple, calculating some values, and then you can very easily, using inPlace or redefining the data frame, then you can drop either a row according to an index or actually a whole column from your data frame. So in the next video then we're going to take a look at more complicated things you'll need to do when adding new columns and calculating values from rows inside the data frame. Any questions or anything, then drop me a comment. Otherwise, thanks very much for watching. See you in the next video.